Hi and Assalamualaikum. The objective of this experiment is to learn the planar kinematic motion, and the second one is to investigate the effect of changing the crank radius.
Ay, ay, alright.
The apparatus that we use in this experiment is crank and slider apparatus connecting rope. By referring to the protector on the apparatus, set the crank at 0 degree. Record the initial position of the connecting rod at the slide by taking the value from the ruler. These are the results that we get from the experiment, and the second table is for graph, where we change the displacement from millimeter to centimeter, and the angle we change to from degree to radian. This is our first graph for 50 millimeter. Second one is for 38 millimeter, and last one is 25 millimeter.
Discussion 1. Explain how a crank and slider system works. When the slider moves to the right, the connecting rod pushes the wheel or crank round for the first 180 degrees of wheel rotation. This crank and slider system usually are applied in the combustion engine. Second, compare and discuss the result from the theoretical and experimental tables. The result from the theoretical is usually fixed, and any kind of external forces are neglected, such as thermal expansion, friction, air pressure. Then, for the experimental result is commonly different from the theoretical result. This is because the result is included with some external force. This is the cause of result of theoretical and experimental is different. Third, give your comment or suggest at least 4 causes of error that may affect the result of the experiment. A. Environmental error is mainly due to thermal expansion that causes the crank to expand too much that it limits the slider from sliding smoothly. B. parallax error, which is the error when taking any measurement. When the eye not be parallel to measurement, it is because a slight error in the dimension or measurement. C. Instrumental error is the error due to damage of rusted instrument. When the crank or slider have slight damage, it will cause an error. D. Human error, which is normal when carrying an experiment that cause the result to be too big or too small. For question 4 for the discussion, list some of practical applications of crank and slider mechanism. First, hand pump. Second, piston. Third, rotary engine. And lastly, winch.
For the discussion, the first question is explain how crank and slider system works. The answer is this mechanism is composed by three important components and parts. The crank, which is the rotating device, the slider, which is slide inside the tube, and the connecting rod, which join the crank and the slider. As the sliders move to the right, the connecting rod push the wheel round for the first 180 degrees of wheel rotation. The second question is compare and discuss the result from theoretical and experimental tables. The result from theoretical and experimental values are different due the error occur during the experiment. It's either the error from apparatus or the people who did the experiment itself. The third question is give your component or suggest at least 4 causes of error that may affect the result of the experiment. 4 causes of error that may affect the result is parallax error, inaccuracy of an apparatus, environment, and thermal expansion. The fourth question is list some of the practical application of a crank and slider mechanism. First is bicycle crank and pedal. Second is crankshaft and connected to the piston. And the third is bulldozer.
Discussion 1. Explain how a crank and slider system work. The rotation of the crank drives the linear movement to the slider, or the crank movement can drive the rotation of the crank. Crank and slider system work out when a fixed pivot is attached to the crank, which turns around and push and pull a slider. When the slider moves to the right, the connecting rod will push the wheel round for the first 180 degrees of wheel rotation. Full rotation of the crank is possible if the eccentricity C is less than the difference between the connecting rod and the crank length, and the crank length is less than the connecting rod length. If that, the connecting rod can pull the wheel round to complete the rotation, just like how the crank slider moves the tires of the train to make sure that the train keeps moving. For the second discussion, compare and discuss the result from the theoretical and experimental table. From the result, we see that there are no differences between theoretical and experimental value, because for the theoretical the values are in millimeter, while at the experimental table the value is in centimeters. The same goes for the angle. the theoretical values are in degree, while in the experimental table the values are in radian. I think that theoretical and the experimental value does not have many differences. The third one, give your comment or suggest at least 4 causes of error that may affect the result of the experiment. First one is random error. All instruments that we use in this experiment have the precision that limit the ability to resolve the measurement differences. The best way to obtain a more precise measurement is by using a null differential method instead of measuring a quantity directly. The null difference is when we using instrumentation to measure the difference between two similar quantities. The two similar quantities can be found by doing a comparison with the reference sample. Second one is systematic error. The calibration of every instrument that we use need to be checked before we use to taking data. If the instrument does not have calibration, the instrument need to be checked by comparing it with another instrument that is at least as precise. Okay, the last one is parallax error. This error is happening when there is some distance between the measuring scale and the indicator that we use to obtain the measurement. If the observer eyes does not align with the pointer and scale, the reading may be too high or too low. As discussion, list some of the practical application of a crank and slider mechanism. First one is hand pump, rotary engine, winch, piston motion equations.
For discussion 1, I will explain on how crank and slider system works. First, a slider crank mechanism is used to convert a rotational motion into reciprocating motion. This mechanism is composed of 3 important parts. First, the crank, which is a rotating disc. Second, the slider, which slides on a fixed plane. And the third one is a connecting rod, which joins the crank and the slider. This mechanism is a kinetic inversion of a bar chain with 1 sliding pair and 3 turning pairs. The total distance that covered by the slider between its 2 extreme positions is called as the path length. This distance is equal to the double times the length of the crank when the axes of crank and slider are in the same line. The second one is to compare and discuss the result from the theoretical and experimental tables. The comparison between theoretical and experimental values are not too much difference in this experiment. For experimental, it is just need to convert the millimeter to centimeter, while the existing angle on the table given is converted to radian, and then just plot a graph of displacement versus radian. Comment or suggestion about the cause of errors that maybe affect this experiment is: first is instrument resolution. Instruments that have precision that limits the ability to resolve small measurement difference. Null or balance methods involve using instrumentation to measure the difference between 2 similar quantities, which is known very accurately and adjustable. The second error is systematic error. This error happens when using a poorly calibrated instrument to measure the length of the crank. If a calibration standard is not available, The accuracy of the instrument should be checked by compared to another instrument or consulting the technical data provided. The third one is parallax error. This error that occurs when there are some distance between the measuring scale and the indicator that used to obtain a measurement. And the last one is error in procedure. Prove the accuracy in measurement by knowing the right tools that will be used in the experiment and apply a correct technique. For discussion 4, there are some application of a crank and slider mechanism, for example, reciprocating engine, hand pump, piston motion equations, and the last one is rotary engine.
In conclusion, from the experiment, I have achieved all of the objectives. I have studied about planar kinematic motion. This application is very important in daily life, especially in engineering. Then, I have studied the effect of changing the crank radius and connecting rod line. This experiment also showed me that many applications that we can use from this theory, such as hand pump, rotary engine, piston, and more.
For the conclusion, the objective were achieved during the experiment. At the end of the experiment, we will study about planar kinematic motion. Other than that, we get to know the result of the experiment dependent on the size of diameter or radius of the shaft.
For conclusion, from the result, we get to achieve the two objectives for this crank and slider experiment. First, we get to study the plane kinematic motion. From this experiment, we get to know that what is the motion the crank and slider use. As we can see from the procedure, by rotating the wheel, we know that it is rotation about a fixed axis, or we can call it as Rafa. For the connecting rod, the movement of the rod is rotation and also rectilinear translation, so we can call it a general plane motion or GPM. The second objective are to study the effect of changing the crank radius and connecting rod length. From the table, we can see that if we change the crank radius every 30 degrees, the connecting rod length also changing. It is shown that if the crank radius is shorter, the connecting rod length also need to be shorter, or not, it will not rotate. These are the conclusions based on my observation for this crank and slider experiment.
Okay, my conclusion is it can be said that both objectives were successfully achieved when we know about planar kinematic motion by knowing that how crank and slider system works and the effect of changing the connecting rod length. By doing this experiment, we study the characteristic of a crank and slider mechanism, such as the proportional relationship between the crank and slider stroke. By observation of the collected data given, we were able to plot a graph of the displacement of the slider crank with respect to the crank angle. In every experiment, we know that there must be some errors, but for this experiment, the cause of error that may be affect is like instrument resolution, systematic error, parallax error, and error in procedure. The practical applications that involved in this experiment are reciprocating engine, hand pump, piston motion, and the rotary engine.